First speaker is Amy Capilazzo. And when you hear your name called, please start making your way to the stage. This is a woman who moves and shakes the art world. She describes the intensity of that world as at match point all the time. She's the chairman of the Fine Arts Division of Sotheby's, Amy Capilazzo.
Thank you. Thank you. And on behalf of all of the Aperitivi here, we would like to thank Ben and Donna for pulling this together and making such a special event. So, thank you. I will be a panelist on the ever-changing art market with the art impresario Adam Lindemann and Bloomberg journalist covering the art market, Katia Kasakina. On the eve of the Brexit vote 8 weeks ago, the British pound was plummeting, and a painting by Pablo Picasso, a 1909 work of exemplary analytical cubism, sold for $64 million at a Sotheby's auction in London. The result represented a 12,000% increase in value from the purchase price 43 years earlier, and more than 7 times the return on the S&P in the same period. The art market has changed dramatically since the first time it sold, also at auction, back in 1973. In fact, the marketplaces hardly resemble each other. The ever-changing art market panel will examine the forces behind the soaring art prices and the shift from art as a collectible to art as a full-on asset class and investment vehicle. Long thought to be erratic and unindexable, the art market now functions like an alternative currency, but with cultural meaning and the dividend of pleasure. The genteel world, where deals were done with a handshake, is now a $64 billion global business and aggregates buyers from around the world like almost no other market. Art galleries, once bespoke, boutique, single proprietor operations, have transformed into multinationals with branches in New York, Los Angeles, London, and Hong Kong. In this brave new world, Warhols and Rothkos, as well as brand new artworks created by young millennials, are traded like stocks and used as collateral for cash loans like real estate. The great American and European masterpieces are now as likely to end up in Hong Kong, Doha, or the free ports of Geneva, Luxembourg, or Singapore as they are above a fireplace on Park Avenue or on a museum's wall. Our lively panel will also discuss the market's recent history and trajectory in the face of economic and political volatility and the essential changes art businesses will have to embrace in order to survive and thrive. Thank you.
Cuba, and that's C-U-B-A. I should have started you on a chorus of that. A new era. We ask what lies ahead. That's what Kent Presents is all about. This 2.5 days is asking what's coming down the pipe. Saturday morning at 9:40 in the recital hall, there's a session called Cuba Enters a New Era at Home and Abroad. And there you'll see the former Cuban First Deputy Foreign Minister, Jose Vieira, in conversation with a renowned specialist on Latin American politics, and in particular, Central America and Cuba. And here he is, Dr. Bill Deogrande.
Thank you. Well, on December 17th, 2014, President Obama and President Raul Castro surprised the world with simultaneous announcements that Cuba and the United States would end half a century of hostility and begin normalizing relations. Right. And since then, things have moved pretty quickly. We've reopened embassies in each other's capitals a year ago. President Obama went to Havana this past March, and new opportunities for business between Cuba and the United States are opening every day. And there's been a surge of U.S. travelers. This year, more than double the number of people that went in 2014. Everyone is rushing to get there before it changes. But there are still many issues that separate Cuba and the United States. The U.S. embargo is still in place. There are holdovers from the old policy of hostility, TV and Radio Marti, which are propaganda broadcasting stations. We still have major issues around migration. We have claims for damages done to one another over those 50 years of hostility. And Cuba wants Guantanamo back. And of course, we have the issue of human rights. The normalization process has not been without controversy. Conservatives in the United States blasted President Obama for normalizing relations without getting something in return. And some leaders in Cuba, including Fidel Castro himself, have been skeptical about US policy, thinking that this policy of engagement is really a Trojan horse, an effort at subversion by other means. These diplomatic changes are also taking place within a context of very fundamental changes within Cuba itself. They began updating their economy to move away from the hyper-centralized Soviet model, which they adopted in the 1970s, toward more of a market socialism on the order of Vietnam or China. There has been a gradual political opening. There is impending transition from the generation of Cuban leaders who founded the revolution to a new generation. Fidel Castro is already retired. Raul will step down as president in 2018. So what does the future hold for Cuba and for US-Cuban relations? Join me and Jose Vieira, former Vice Minister of Foreign Relations of Cuba, Saturday morning, and we'll tell you. Thanks.
Among how many of you is the election the topic at home at the moment? Or is it prohibited in your house for reasons of blood pressure? Well, here on this stage tomorrow afternoon at 10 minutes past 3, it'll be front and center, but with a true expert, non-partisan, that's the crucial word, described as the man who knows more about everything political than anyone else. You'll know him when you see him, from television and perhaps from the Cook Report. And now, please welcome Charlie Cook.
I laughed when you said that because I had to ban my wife, or not ban, but suggest that she stop watching Morning Joe because she was getting completely neurotic over Trump. I know that it's in bad form, and given the last year, certainly risky to say that this general election is over, and so I'm not. But at the same time, I think it's terribly misleading to say that this presidential general election is truly competitive, or that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have more or less the equal chances of winning. And I think if you look at it sort of several different metrics, you kind of reach the same conclusion of at least where this race is right now. You look at the national polling, Clinton is up by about 6 to 8 points. You look at the individual states, and you know, Donald Trump does not lead in any single state that President Obama carried in 2012. His Rust Belt strategy seems to be working okay in Ohio, where he's behind by less than a point or so, but in Pennsylvania and Michigan, those are not working well for him, so that strategy doesn't seem to be panning out. And in states that were not particularly competitive in 2012, like Arizona and Georgia, he's got his hands full. And in fact, the Clinton campaign is actually pulling some of their ads out of states like Colorado and Virginia, states that were very competitive in the last 2 elections, because the lead got so wide and that it didn't seem like the best place to spend their money. And then the third is if you look at how the candidates are perceived, and whether you're looking at favorable, unfavorable ratings, whether you're looking at various candidate attributes that polls are comparing. This is not a level playing field right now. And that's not to say that exogenous events couldn't change things, that disclosures of one kind or another, but for every Clinton email or Clinton Foundation thing over here, there's Donald Trump's income taxes and Trump U and things like that over there. But I guess the one piece of advice, while I've got everybody here, and 15 seconds. Watch the poll aggregators. Go on like realclearpolitics.com, pollster.com, and look at the averages. Don't cherry pick or don't react to every last poll. Boom, right on the zero. I'm there. Thank you.
I should add, by the way, that Charlie's interlocutor in his session will be somebody who has an encyclopedic knowledge of politics. He's a resident of Kent. He was John Lindsay's chief of staff. Sometime in his teens or his 20s, he was John Lindsay's chief of staff, Jay Kriegel, and he'll be here as a constant presence as well. Our next speaker is Professor of Medicine, Community and Family Medicine at the Dartmouth Institute. He'll be in the recital hall on Friday at 8:30 in the morning, dwelling on this riveting point: less medicine, more health. He says that too many of us are being told that we're ill He's Dr. Gil Welch.
My father died of colon cancer my first year of medical school. He was 60. I outlived him last year. My wife first felt her breast cancer about 20 years ago. She's doing fine. It was a year after her mother died of lung cancer at age 61 and 3 years after her cousin died of breast cancer in her 40s. You might reasonably suspect I'm a strong proponent for early cancer detection. Yet my research over the last quarter century leads me to believe our cancer screening efforts are creating more problems than they solve. Go figure. Is that an odd-tasting aperitif? The basic problem is whenever we doctors look hard for early disease, we find more than we expected. Given the time and the money to do a lot of testing, I'm confident I could find something wrong with just about everybody in this room. Maybe not you, Ben. You might be the last well person on the planet. It turns out the human body is full of abnormalities, especially as we age. Not surprisingly, our early detection efforts set off a whole lot of false alarms. But what is less widely understood is that we can also identify disease, even cancer, that will never bother the patient. Doctors aren't sure which things will or will not matter, so we intervene on all of them. And that can cause real problems: medication side effects, surgical complications, even death. Remember, these people weren't sick. They were trying to stay well. And even if they avoid getting hurt in the process, they run up a big bill. Medical care is one of the most prominent causes of personal bankruptcy in this country. That can't be good for your health. I'm a conventionally trained physician. I believe modern medical care can do a lot of good, particularly for people who are acutely ill or injured. But at the same time, I believe many Americans receive too much medical care that doesn't make them any healthier, medical care that can make them both sicker and poorer. So if you want to really belly up to a bar tomorrow morning for more than an aperitif, please join me and Bob Donovan. Thank you.
Perfect. Be here in this auditorium on Saturday at 3:10 if you want this question answered: where is Putin taking Russia? 2 ambassadors will be on the podium. Is there a collective noun for ambassadors? A tact of ambassadors? A diplomacy of ambassadors? One is Tom Pickering. He was the ambassador to India, UN, Israel, El Salvador, Jordan, and yes, Russia, 93 to 96. The other's here now, and yes, again. From 1987 to 1991, he was our man where? In Moscow. Former US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock.
Our panel is on the topic, where is Putin taking Russia? Now, maybe we should be talking about where is Russia taking Putin. But I think that I'll be talking mainly about how the United States is pushing Russia and how many of the things which we don't like that Putin has done has been in response to US actions. We need to look at those as the cause. The point is that Russia is important to us. We will not be able to solve the major problems of the 21st century without some cooperation from Russia. Russians are going to determine their own government and how it operates. Our attempts to influence that tend to have a negative effect. But we have a vital interest in cooperating in Russia, particularly in the nuclear issue. And I think we have other panels on that. We'll be talking about that in our panel. In the final analysis, I believe that Russia, whether under Putin or any other leader, basic interests are not in conflict with the United States. And the task of diplomacy on both sides is to find those common interests. because the things that face us, the most serious interests, problems that face us in this century, can only be solved by cooperation. Russia will either be part of the problem or part of the solution, and our diplomacy should be aimed at encouraging them to be part of the solution.
Here's a question. Can art, like poetry, be defined famously, Wordsworthianly, as emotions recollected in tranquility? No, because art is immediate. Thank you, Monsieur Cartier-Bresson. And thank you, Gordon Parks, whose work will illuminate Kent and the Dickinson Hall on Saturday at 2 o'clock in a session that will mark the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, one of the contributors on the panel is a MacArthur Fellow. She's chair of photography at the Tisch School of the Arts in New York University. She's the art photographer and historian, Dr. Deborah Willis.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure. This afternoon, just learning from this experience, we're going to expand just the idea of the earlier conversation about Black Lives Matter. We'll have an opportunity, as the three of us, it's Sarah Lewis, Latoya Ruby Frazier. We will talk about the impact that Gordon Parks had on all of us. Gordon Parks believed that it's a changing tide, and looking at the idea of photography in the 60s and in the 50s. How do we change the tides? How do we make a difference as photographers? We're also going to talk about art and social justice, what it meant to stand in front and behind the camera during a time when we were visualizing stories and looking at stories from the 50s and 60s. Was also to think about early on when Gordon Parks made images in 1942 and the 1930s in Chicago. So we're going to look at the access of what happens when we don't have access to education and what happens to environmental concerns. And these photographers, as well as writers such as Sarah Lewis, will share stories along with myself looking at the images of Gordon Parks. Hope to see you there Saturday. Thank you.
We had the Russians a moment ago, a different shade of red now. On Saturday afternoon here at 2 o'clock, behind the red curtain, Understanding China. You know, one of the pleasures of living in Kent is bumping in now and then to Henry Kissinger. He's involved in the life of the town. He and Nancy actively support many local causes. And we'll get a chance to hear his huge brain in gear, and if you haven't heard it, it is impressive, as he discusses China with a former ambassador to Beijing and a man whose career had the highest possible diplomatic ranking, J. Stapleton Roy.
Good afternoon. Public opinion polls show that when ordinary Americans like you and me are asked, what's the first thing that comes into your mind when the country China is mentioned, the answers tend to cluster around food, culture, and pandas. Not the Tiananmen massacre, not human rights, not strategic rivalry, not the South China Sea, not even loss of jobs, or blunders in negotiating trade agreements. Henry Kissinger and I hope to change all that in a few brief moments on Saturday afternoon. We will boil down 5,000 years of Chinese history into a few pithy sound bites. We will enable you to impress your neighbors by talking knowledgeably about why China is upset over the deployment of U.S. THAAD missiles to South Korea, speaking with the confidence that comes from knowing that THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missiles. We will arm you with a basic understanding of why generals and admirals in Washington and Beijing are preparing to fight to the death over uninhabitable rocks and shoals in the South China Sea. We will explain why the Chinese and Russians are now warmly embracing each other because of mutual concerns about the American threat. Bearing in mind that less than 50 years ago, the Russians and Chinese were hurling bullets and insults at each other because of their concerns, mutual concerns about the Soviet threat. And Chairman Mao, in the midst of the great cultural revolution, was prepared to welcome the prince of the imperialists, President Nixon, to Beijing because of the Soviet threat. We will even touch on why China, after the fastest and most successful modernization process in human history, is now desperately seeking to curb the influence of the Western ideas and concepts that underpin their success. And we will provide a few morsels of wisdom on why constructive US-Chinese relations are in the interests of both countries. If you want to hear about Chinese food, culture, and pandas, go elsewhere. If you want to understand why President Xi Jinping lives in mortal terror of becoming a Chinese Gorbachev, join Dr. Kissinger and me on Saturday.
Earlier here on Saturday, 10 minutes after noon, don't get the impression from your program that a session called a gene alteration has anything to do with tailoring. Well, actually it does in a way, because it's about the fact that science now has the capacity to remodel our genetic heredity. I've got a few ideas there. This platform will have 2 Nobel laureates on it. There's another collective noun. We should have a competition for collective nouns. A dazzle of laureates, a wreath of laureates. One of them is here, Nobel class of 1975, so to speak, for physiology and medicine, Dr. David Baltimore.
Yes, Harold Varmus and I will have this conversation. I would just as soon listen to Harold, but I think you'll have to listen to me. Take yourself back to 1800. You went walking, you picked up a rock, and you saw on it a fossil of a fish, something you hadn't ever seen before. Your reaction would have been, isn't it fascinating that God put this delicately carved fossil on Earth so I could find and admire it? I'll take it home and put it in the drawer with all the other lovely things I've found. You would not have entertained the idea that this organism had lived on Earth earlier in history. The whole idea that life evolves, that change is an intrinsic part of living, had no currency then. And then came Darwin around 1850 and later, and the growing realization through the late 19th century that change is in the nature of the world. In fact, earlier than that, Charles Elachi couldn't have assumed that you would all understand the evolution of the planets, because there was no notion even that the physical world had evolved. But only with Mendel at the end of the 19th century do we begin to understand what that kind of change involves. He introduced genes and units of heredity. In the 1920s, Hermann Muller showed that you could change genes with radiation in his case. And then in the 1940s, Avery showed that genes were units in DNA somehow. And then in 1953, Watson and Crick showed just how DNA stores information. And then the problem stopped being these ethereal notions of a gene and started being chemistry. And then we learned how to extract DNA, to cut DNA, to paste DNA. And over about 60 years, the technology of dealing with DNA came. But the last thing we couldn't do was think about altering genes in situ in human cells, because we just didn't have a method that would do that. We understood how you would do it, but we couldn't do it. And then came CRISPR-Cas9. In 2013, CRISPR-Cas9 was adapted to use in human cells and allows the cutting of DNA at any particular chosen place inside a cell without altering the cell. It's quite a story. It's about 150 years from total ignorance to the existence of precise control. Doesn't feel like 2.5 minutes. And now the question is, what will we do with it? And that is the question that you will all have a chance to talk about.
That was a close-run thing. Aging. I shall be 40 years old in October. What? That's rude. I am already 40 years old. I will still be 40 years old in October. But I am interested in aging. We have a session in the recital hall on Saturday in which Professor Dina Katabi of MIT can discuss what impact falls have on our lives and other factors that affect aging and accelerate aging. She's going to be moderated perhaps, by another MIT person. Last year I was interviewing a doctor who'd been to MIT and Harvard, and I said to him, MIT and Harvard, not very bright then. Mark Gorenberg will be the moderator.
Thank you. As you suggested, falls are the #1 cause of hospitalization and the #1 cause of fatal injuries for seniors. Professor Dina Katabi and her group at MIT has created a box as small as a Wi-Fi box that can detect and even predict falls before they happen. Her breakthrough has transformed Defense Department radar techniques into a consumer device that can look through walls and can, even without wearing a monitoring device like the ones that you see on TV, she can look at your movement, she can hear your heart rate, she can understand your breathing and other vitals that you may have. Professor Katabi grew up in Syria, where she was the #1 college student there and came to MIT 20 years ago as a PhD, now a professor. She's a MacArthur Fellow, and she's creating a leading lab in wireless networks and in mobile computing at MIT. Her product, Emerald, that allows aging in place, has been celebrated by almost every major newspaper, and she demonstrated it earlier this year to President Obama in the White House. And so we're very honored on Saturday morning, and it's at 8:30, and I hope you'll all wake up that early to come see her demonstrate it for us. Thank you very much.
Since I was a teenager living in a small Irish village, I've been fascinated with American politics. And later as a reporter, I got to cover some election campaigns here. But since I came to live here 14, 15 years ago, my fascination changed and changed quite quickly. I now believe that the most absorbing, even enthralling single public institution in the United States is the Supreme Court. In the recital hall on Saturday morning at 9:40, you can hear answers to this question: where is the Supreme Court headed? Answers from, among others, the Dean of the NYU Law School, Trevor Morrison.
Thank you. I think it's clearly correct that the Supreme Court is the most absorbing institution in American public life, but this is an especially absorbing time for that. For us to look at that institution. One cannot recall a presidential election whose outcome would more obviously and more immediately have an immediate bearing on the Supreme Court than this one. And so with my co-panelists, Danielle Gray, a former law clerk to Justice Breyer and then longtime senior official within the Obama administration, and Jeff Wall, former law clerk to Justice Thomas, and then longtime assistant to the Solicitor General in the SG's office, arguing before the court, we will do a few things. We will take up some of the major events at the Supreme Court over the last term, and so that includes some of its most significant decisions, but also the most significant event at the Supreme Court in the last term, which was the unexpected death of Justice Scalia, creating the vacancy still at the court that will, in one way or another, evidently be decided by the outcome of this November's presidential election. In surveying the major decisions of last term, we will note a couple of things: that the courts moved from being at its full complement of 9 to 1 short at 8, caused some of the most consequential decisions to be non-decisions at the court. 4 divisions, including in particular on a very important immigration case testing the Obama administration's deferred action program. Really, that ended, at least in that chapter, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Other decisions did produce majorities, and so final decisions at the court. This includes a very important affirmative action decision and a very important abortion decision, and in each of those we see a trend that could become an important one at the court, namely an apparently leftward shift on the part of Justice Kennedy. For many years since Justice O'Connor's retirement, the really gravitational middle of the court, Justice Kennedy appears to have tilted a little bit further left over the course of the last year than one might have predicted, although our panelists will talk about whether they were surprised by this or predicted it. We'll also look at the coming term. At this point, the coming term in terms of its cases is not terribly interesting, perhaps in part because the court with 8 members is not sure what major issues it ought to try and take up. The grant rate, as we call it, for major cases in the coming term is quite low. What we do need to confront, however, is who will occupy this vacant seat. Will the nominee, Merrick Garland, make it through? And of course, that has everything to do with the outcome of November's election. Ever since I told my father-in-law with absolute certainty that there was no chance the Supreme Court would take the Bush versus Gore case, I have tried to get out of the prognostication business myself, but I suspect that I will fail to stop myself from making some predictions tomorrow, and Danielle and Jeff will offer much more learned thoughts on that. One premise that at least some of us will have, I suspect, is that the current Senate majority is minimally rational enough to confirm Merrick Garland as its last act during the lame duck session if Hillary Clinton wins the presidency. However, I think there will be some disagreement on the panel, both as to the premise of minimal rationality and as to what might follow from that. Thanks.
Words may change their meanings, but meanings change too. At noontide on Saturday, you have a session called Globalizing Modernism. And in the 1930s, when modernism's crazy uncle, Ezra Pound, yelled, "Make it new," what he meant was novel writing, streams of consciousness, the looming approach of gonzo journalism, self-referential painting. He wasn't speaking to or about Persia or Pakistan. What am I on about? Explanation, elaboration will come from the author and art critic, Eleanor Hartney.
Thank you. I feel like I have to do 90-minute Shakespeare here. Okay, so this panel will be a conversation between an art critic, myself, an art historian, Pepe Carmel, and Shazia Sikander, who is a MacArthur Award winner and one of the world's most acclaimed contemporary artists. Sikander holds a special place in the contemporary art world. Born and schooled in Pakistan, she came to the US for graduate studies at RISD and has remained here ever since. In the meantime, while working both in Pakistan and here, she is single-handedly responsible for the contemporary revival of the Indo-Persian tradition of miniature painting, which, until she brought it forward, was really considered a kind of backwater of traditional art in Pakistan. She, in bringing this forward, has imbued it with new meanings. She has taken it and expanded on it so that it can talk about contemporary issues and imagery, and in the process has generated a whole school of neo-miniature painters who themselves have begun to gain great international acclaim. Meanwhile, she has gone on to become a multimedia artist whose work bridges the gaps between tradition and modernity, East and West, nationalism and globalism, the personal and the political. So, it's clear, her work has great significance within the art world. But I believe it has much more important implications as well for the larger world. And this kind of goes back to some of the discussion that we heard in the earlier sessions. As you all know, in the last few decades, it seems that every field of human activity has been transformed by the breakdown of physical, geopolitical, and electronic borders. Suddenly, and the rhetoric that we have been hearing in the presidential campaign, I think, confirms this, the possibility and even the idea of globalism seems to be cast into doubt. The many geopolitical crises and the often frightening responses to them raise questions about whether we can still embrace difference when borders are being forcibly reinstated, immigrants are being sent home to places where they may be killed or maybe never even lived, and calls for nationalism blend with demands for purity and rage at the notion of identity politics. Sikander's work is vital at this moment because it offers a vision in which globalism serves as a crossroads of diverse cultures and encourages multiple viewpoints and complex thinking. She offers a way to be political without being polemical and to embrace multiple identities without devolving into stereotype. This is the kind of thinking that the world sorely needs now. And if this isn't enough, as well as being a brilliant thinker, her work is drop-dead beautiful, and you'll get a chance to see a lot of it. Thank you.
Here at KentPresents, we like to call it as it is, and on this stage, Saturday morning at 8:30, we have a session titled Dealing with the Middle East Mess. And in 2009, President Obama sent one of our speakers with a mop, metaphorically, as an ambassador to Iraq, Christopher Hill.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to discuss these cheery subjects such as the Middle East, and I'm also on another panel dealing with nuclear meltdowns and whatnot. But let me say about the Middle East, you may be sick and tired of the Middle East, but the Middle East is not sick and tired of you. The Middle East continues to really incubate and inspire many of the crises going on in the world. If you look at some of the political crises going on in Europe, some of the odd people winning elections in Europe, you can see that some refugees, some humanitarian elements of the Middle East crisis is driving those political crises in Europe. I won't get into what is going on in this country, as I've always managed to stay out of the internal affairs of countries I've been assigned to, and I'm assigned to the United States right now, except to say, people need to realize that unless this Middle East is addressed, it will have effects domestically in this country as well. Now, we have a great panel. We have Chase Robinson, who is the president at CUNY in the department dealing with PhDs. He's also a PhD himself in pre-modern Middle East. Some may argue that goes right up to the present, but he knows a thing or two about the language, the cultures, and the political, the politics of that region of the world. Also, we're very blessed to have Hussein al-Majali, who is a former senior official from Jordan, knows a lot of the situation on the ground, especially as that country has been host to more refugees than I think any other country has been. And of course, we have Tom Pickering, who has been ambassador in just about every country in the world, including several in the Middle East. Now, as we talk about these issues, you'll find that if you ever have to take a multiple choice question on the Middle East, may I suggest you always go for all of the above, because is this current crisis a Sunni-Shia crisis? Yes, in part it is. Is it a Sunni-Sunni crisis? Yes, indeed, it has that. Is it a crisis of failed nation states? Of course, it is a crisis of that. Is it a crisis in America's inability to understand things that we are getting so up to our eyeballs in? Yes, it is a crisis of our lack of understanding. So in respect to that last point, let us hope that we can shed some light on that in our panel on the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Mr. Van. Great. Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock in the recital hall, we have a possible tug of war, and let's see if opposites really do attract. The discussion is a guaranteed income for every American. trade unionist Andy Stern versus a libertarian who's with us now, and he is no stranger to controversy. This is Charles Murray.
So you're going to have a stalwart representative of the progressive left, Andrew Stern, and a libertarian like me, and we aren't really going to be debating, because we both think that a universal basic income is the way to go. Now, we will give you a variety of reasons for saying it's the way to go, and I'm sure they'll be different, and I'm not going to try to anticipate what Andrew's going to say. I think that in some cases we'll point out it's actually going to be cheaper than the current system in many ways. It is also going to deal with poverty in ways that have been proved utterly intractable over the last 40 or 50 years. There are a variety of other things that it will do that are pretty much in the standard economic realm. Among other things, it'll get us out of our entitlement crisis. Speaking for myself, I'm going to raise two other issues. One of them is that providing an income that's deposited electronically every month into an account creates a kind of moral agency all by itself. I call it the Doolittle effect, after Alfred P. Doolittle, who you'll remember from My Fair Lady, where he is, because he's been given some money, he is forced into middle-class morality. Well, it is the case that if you have an income, you can no longer claim victimhood with your girlfriend, with your parents, with your friends, with your neighbors in the way you could before. They can try to help you when you have problems because you've done something so you don't have any money until the end of the month. But they're also in a position to say to you, you know, it's time for you to get your act together. Don't try to tell us there's nothing you can do about your situation. And that leads to the second point that I'm going to try to make, which is that a guaranteed income that replaces the entire welfare state has a chance of revitalizing America's civil society, one in which human needs are dealt with at that level, which is the only effective level for dealing with human needs, and that is in the community, within the family, people talking to friends, spouses, significant others, neighbors, and the rest. And in that, we have our best chance to recover one of the signal features of American exceptionalism.
Last year here, our next speaker was involved in what was, to me, the most memorable exchange of the 2.5 days of the first Kent Presents. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. It was a session about gun control, and he provided more illumination in one answer than most of what I have seen in the entire debate. He has since changed disciplines at the New York Times. He's now writing about sport and possibly writing today about swimmers. And in sport in general, there's a terrifically contentious question, so relevant here in this state, given UConn's basketball teams. Should college athletes be paid? Here's John Nocera.
Start at 2:30. Hi. About 5.5 or 6 years ago, I got interested in the business of college sports. I'd always been interested in college sports, as fun, as entertainment, but I'd never really thought of it as a business. And when you think of it as a business, you realize that it's actually a multi-billion-dollar entertainment complex that happens to be attached to universities. And it's also governed by this thing called the NCAA, which I became mildly obsessed with. Why did I become obsessed with it? Because the NCAA is one of the worst organizations in the United States in terms of the way it restricts the rights and the abilities of players. And as I got into it, and I started to think about it more as an economic issue rather than a sports issue, I came to see that the NCAA was actually a cartel that existed to depress the wages of the labor force. The labor force are the players. They get nothing. I became a proponent of the idea that men's basketball and college football players should be paid. How they get paid and all that sort of thing, I will talk about tomorrow. But it seemed to me a matter of both economic justice and, when you think about it, civil rights, since the vast majority of men's basketball players and college football players are black. By the way, the NCAA allows Olympic swimmers, most of whom are white, to keep any money that they get, even if they're in college. Just throw that out. My columns led to a book, but they also led to an acquaintanceship with Echo Yanka, who has already spoken once here today. And he takes the opposite position, that players should not be paid, and he builds it around an idealism about what college should be and can be, and a kind of purity of what college sports should be. I know this because he and I have tangled before a long time ago. So we're going to do it again tomorrow. And now everybody who's come before has talked about how civil the discussions are going to be, yada, yada, yada. He and I are going to have a brawl. So I hope you come and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Wouldn't it be nice if we also had something about the US women's soccer team not being paid fairly? Those of you who were here last year may also recall one of the opening plenary sessions. It was a sane, civil, profoundly informed and memorable interview by David Sanger of the New York Times with Ambassador William Burns about the Iran deal. Well, tomorrow morning here at 8:30, David Sanger is back to discuss the balance between security and liberty. Interesting balance, interesting tipping points, with a panel that includes President George W. Bush's Homeland Security Advisor, Dr. Francis Townsend.
Well, if you're undaunted by my former colleague, Ambassador Chris Hill's subjects like the Middle East and nuclear proliferation, how about this one? At 8:30 on a Saturday morning, I assure you, you're not going to need coffee to get your heart going. When we're talking about the threats, I think you'll find that the panel agrees the threats to this country are on the rise. But what does that mean? And what is the consequence of that amidst a presidential election? We have the head of MI6, the former head of MI6, former Deputy Secretary of State Tom Pickering, and David Sanger to discuss those threats. But are they hype or is it real? How are we to think about that in the context of the upcoming presidential election when we have at least one candidate suggesting it's okay not only to bomb terrorists but their families, that we should return to things like enhanced interrogation techniques? And why don't we have that conversation now? And so whether you think it's hype or real, be sure that you will have strong feelings. Be sure that you will either be terrified or angry by the conversation, and you will be asked to be involved. You will be asked to voice your opinions and voice your views, because we don't tend to do that when there's a threat. We tend to do it only after the event. And so the conversation at 8:30 tomorrow morning is a really important one for everybody here, because this is the conversation that ought to be happening before there's an event in this country, not after, and I hope you'll join us.
Now here's something absolutely mega. You're about to meet the world's most brilliant surfer. You might be surprised to hear me describing him like that. But he's a physicist who grabs the popular imagination and has been at the core of something extraordinary. He's been surfing gravitational waves. Do you remember the world's excitement last year, gravitational waves? Well, you're going to hear those waves break again here tomorrow, just after noon, from the man who first surfed their tide, Dr. Kip Thorne.
A billion light years away from here and a billion years ago, two black holes spiraled around and around, creating ripples in the fabric of space and time,
that traveled outward into the universe, bringing a picture of themselves. Each black hole was the size of Connecticut, yet weighed 30 times as much as our sun. Its gravity was so strong that nothing could escape it. And as they spiraled together and collided, they created a veritable storm in the fabric of space and time, like the storm in which ocean waves crash. Now, Ben and Donna have forbidden us to show any slides in these 2.5-minute presentations, but you said nothing about showing something on my chest. So, this is a still from a movie at noon tomorrow, explanation at noon tomorrow, depicting the storm as it would be seen by a bulk being living in the fifth dimension, actually coming from a computer simulation. As the storm blew, it converted 3 times as much mass as the sun has into gravitational wave energy so quickly that the total power output, the energy per unit time, was 50 times more than the luminosity of all the stars in the universe put together. And yet all of this power came off as gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space and time, traveling outward into the universe, bringing a picture of what was going on. Here on Earth, LIGO, a set of instruments here in the United States, captured those waves as they pushed masses back and forth by distances of 1/100th the diameter of a proton, and converted the signal into information that enabled us to do the simulations that told us what was going on. Tomorrow morning, Walter Isaacson, the great biographer of Albert Einstein, and I will describe the creation of LIGO, how it came into being, how we built on the shoulders of Albert Einstein in order to make this happen, a quest of 50 years since my colleagues and I began it. And we'll describe the fantastic technology of LIGO, and we'll describe the future, what this may bring in the coming decades and centuries. Thank you.
On Saturday morning at 9:40, I'm going to be in the Dickinson because I want to hear a speaker whom I know to be thoughtful, humorous, and sharp, and a fine writer. His book, Picasso and the Invention of Cubism, should be on all your shelves. He'll be moderating a panel called A Fine Romance. A Fine Romance. Enough of that. It's all about the relationship, crucial, perhaps more so now with the world art market, between museums and collectors. He's the author, curator, teacher, Pepe Carmel.
Thank you, Frank. Actually, I'll be trying to say as little as possible myself because, in fact, we have 3 absolutely extraordinary speakers: Colin Bailey, the director of the Morgan Library and Museum; Thomas Campbell, the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art; and Gary Tinterow, the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. These guys know an amazing amount about what it means to run a museum, what it means to work with collectors, and I really just want to stand back and let them do their thing. But let me say a few words about the theme of this panel. First, the romance that has to happen between museums and collectors to have a great museum. You can think of it as the museum director going, "Your Renoirs, they're such a lovely color." And the collector, "And your galleries, they're so big and tall." It's not simply a romance. It's a relationship that, like other relationships, is often full of tension. The museum professional tends to say, "Thank you very much for your pictures. We really appreciate it. We'll take it from here." The collectors are often visionaries. They have their own idea of why these paintings and sculptures were important, how they want them displayed, where they want their name, and so forth. So there can be a kind of a pull and a tug between these different forces, and our 3 speakers will be exploring some historic and contemporary examples of different ways in which museums and collectors have worked out their relationship problems or their relationships. Now, this will not be exclusively serious. I've gotten a preview of what they're going to say, and there will be a lot of fun here. Colin Bailey will be showing us how some great San Francisco donors worked out their differences with pistols, shooting at each other. Tom Campbell will be reuniting a Spanish mother with her lost son. And Gary Tintereau will show us René Magritte, the great Belgian surrealist, at a rodeo in Texas. If that is not surrealistic, I do not know what is. So please come Saturday to join the fun. Thank you.
Next year at Kent Presents, next year, it's perfectly possible that all of us, Ben, Donna, Michael, all the crew, Elizabeth, Zaida, myself, that we won't be here. We'll be replaced by robots. In the recital hall, and they'll be much tougher on you than I've been, in the recital hall tomorrow at 10 minutes after 3, perhaps we'll hear our fate in that session. It's called Robotics, the Promise and the Reality, from a panel that includes a truly remarkable man. You know, if you ever hear a former MIT professor say, I'm just an engineer who builds robots, I think you're entitled to say, yeah, right. Mark Raybart.
People and animals are incredible in the physical things they can do. I mean, look at me right now, just standing here, balancing, not falling over. Okay, you're not impressed enough. How about like this? How about like this? I can traverse this whole room, climbing the stairs. I can go outside and climb a mountain. Not only can I physically go anywhere I want to go, my perception system is incredibly able to interpret complex scenes. Like right now, I can identify each of you as an individual. There's what, 300 people here? And my system has no trouble doing that. It's just astounding. How about my hands? I can reach into my pocket, and even without looking, I can tell, here's my valet ticket, here's a memory stick with my talk on it for tomorrow, and here's a quarter. And I can take the quarter out without looking at it and manipulate it in my fingers. And all of you can do that, and animals can do things comparable in complexity. So my goal as a robot builder is to build robots that can do all of these things. Robots that have mobility, that have dexterity, that have perception and understand the world around them. Now, why should we build robots like that? I think they're going to be incredibly useful. We're going to send them into burning buildings to fight fires. We're going to send them to Fukushima. I was at Fukushima recently. We're going to send them there, and instead of having people in paper suits with breathers, they're going to clear the contaminated soil and put it in a safe place. But I also hope we're going to have them in all your houses cleaning your bathrooms and maybe helping your aging parents, or judging by the age of this audience, helping your children with their aging parents. So come to the talk tomorrow. We'll show you the state of the art in building machines that can do that. I'll have a live robot in the flesh, one that can navigate your home, take out the trash, maybe clean your bathroom someday. And at the end, we'll have a conversation and talk and maybe dream about the future of what robots will bring us. Thank you.
Now, we're in New England, so let's invoke Mark Twain. I'm glad he said the old masters are dead. I wish they'd died sooner. Tomorrow, at 4:30 in Dickinson, there's a session called Are Old Masters Relevant in the High-Fueled World of Contemporary Art? One of the contributors will be the director of the art collections at the Huntington. He's in from LA, Dr. Kevin Sabatino.
We're in the awkward position of competing with a robot tomorrow. In September of 2015, the hedge fund manager Kenneth C. Griffin bought a painting by Willem de Kooning from David Geffen for, it was reported, $300 million. And another painting, this one by Jackson Pollock, for $200 million. Griffin thus allegedly spent $500 million for a few square feet of painted canvas. To put that into some perspective, here's one statistic. According to the nonprofit Water Wells for Africa, $500 million could pay for 71,429 wells in Africa, each one serving 2,000 people, for a total of 142,858,000 people served. The breathtaking sums being spent on trophy art by the mega-wealthy, mostly, though not exclusively, on modern and contemporary art, forces the following questions. Does market value reflect actual or intrinsic value? Does it, in fact, dictate value? What is the relationship between art and commerce, and how does art as a commodity, or an asset class, to quote Amy, influence our perception of its meaning and significance? To what extent are museums complicit in this? What does the dramatic global proliferation of museums of contemporary art mean for the survival, through attention, through, that is, the relevance of older art, especially when so many living artists are themselves deeply interested in that older art? Is a more universal interest in the art of the past dying? And if so, how can it be revived? Can contemporary art rejuvenate older art's aging body? Or is it, or maybe a robot, or is its ultimate demise a given in an age Douglas Copeland has called the extreme present? Are we, to quote a recent MoMA exhibition title, living truly and inescapably in the forever now? Will we be watching a Rembrandt versus Jeff Koons WWF SmackDown, perhaps refereed by Donald Trump, or are we instead, or can we instead hope for a relationship made in heaven? Come here, Thomas Campbell, director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Scott Rothkopf, Chief Curator of the Whitney Museum of American Art, Carter Foster, Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Blanton Museum of Art, and me tomorrow afternoon to find out. Thank you.
That's fine. At 11 o'clock tomorrow in this auditorium, you can find out whether we are back at the nuclear brink. And one of those thinking out loud, telling us where the edge of the cliff is located nowadays, is a man who, in his day, dismantled thousands of nuclear weapons, effectively, when he was President Clinton's defense secretary, Bill Perry.
In the stillness of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Those prophetic lines, written by William Butler Yeats, were written in 1914 on the eve of World War I. Today, they might well apply to the Mideast, where the nations seem to each be sequestered in their hate. But not just the Mideast. The dogs are barking in the South China Sea, in the Crimea, in the Baltics, in Ukraine, and there the barking could conceivably result in a nuclear catastrophe. I am a child of the Cold War, where each day we lived with a dark nuclear cloud hanging over our heads, threatening no less than the end of civilization. When the Cold War ended, I was hugely relieved because I believed that my children and my grandchildren would not have to live with that dark nuclear cloud. But that was not to be. Today, we are embarked on building a new nuclear weapons. Today, we're in the early stages of a second Cold War. Today, I believe the likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe is actually greater than it was during the Cold War, actually greater than during the Cold War. We are sleepwalking towards an existential catastrophe. During the Cold War, Andrei Sakharov wrote, "Preventing a nuclear catastrophe must carry an absolute priority over all other considerations. And so it did then, and so it should today. Tomorrow, Chris Hill, Dave Sanger, and myself will talk about why and how. Thank you.
And tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock here, Feminism's Challenges in the 21st Century come under the eye of a panel that includes the woman who transformed Planned Parenthood. I think I'm right in saying she was its youngest ever president, and who, for my money, nailed one of the core principles in gender inequality when she observed, the deal is that women have entered the workforce, but they have not been relieved of the domestic responsibilities. Faye Wattleton.
Thank you, and I'm so honored to be among this august group of men and women who are a part of KentPresents. And I'm honored also to be asked to speak on the subject and to participate in this panel tomorrow afternoon. If you're convinced that women have achieved equality of rights and opportunities, and if you believe that feminism is an outmoded, politically correct relic of the 20th century, and your daughters, your granddaughters, and even some of your friends are comfortable that women-focused issues, that is, feminism, is part of the past that we need to move on from there because it's just plain divisive. I think a few facts might help you to look at what 21st century women are challenged by. Now, I make no claims to comprehensiveness about the panel or of my aperitif today, but let me just give you a few markers of the progress that half the human race have made. The citadels of power, that is industry and commerce, on corporate boards, women are well established in law and in finance and business, and yet in S&P 1,500 companies, only 16% of women are on boards, of the boards are comprised of women. At this rate, it is estimated that it will take 40 years to reach parity in the boardroom. In the executive suite, it is even more regrettable. Only 21 women are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. 29 women, of the 29 companies that entered the S&P 1500 last year, only one was a woman CEO. Going on to look at political representation, there are only 6 women governors, 20 women senators, 84 congresswomen, and it will take almost at this pace a century after after we have won the right to vote. We are still far behind in parity. With respect to economic status, well, we've made a lot of progress, but in the past year we have seen the gap widen. 66% of women, 60% of wage earning of similar work occurred with women in 2014, 64% now. These are just a few of the markers. Women artists are doing better, but still there is a great disparity in the number of exhibits that the major museums and artistic institutions display women. Finally, with respect to health, there is perhaps the most significant marker of a society's status in the status of its women and its health with respect to health. I would urge you to join Eleanor Hartney, Laura Simmons, Darren Walker, and me tomorrow afternoon to look at some of these issues because, as it has been stated, we need to keep on crunching the numbers because, after all, counting and numbers is a feminist strategy. Thank you.
Now, if Kent Presents is serious about asking what comes next, and we are, we must therefore ask, will the machines be taking over? And here in this hall tomorrow morning at 9:40, in the session Artificial Intelligence and Society, Separating Fact from Fiction, you may get startling answers from a panel that includes this man. He's the Senior Vice President, Cognitive Solutions and Research at IBM, John Kelly.
Good afternoon. Throughout human history, we have created tools to increase our human capability, tools that increase our strength, tools that move us through space more quickly. Over the last century, humans have created computers to increase our ability to compute numbers and begin to reason. 50 years ago, man began to study artificial intelligence and try to replicate what this computer, this 20-watt, roughly 2-core computer does miraculously, and that is reason and learn on its own, understand natural language, and understand its environment. Humans have tried for decades to solve the problem of artificial intelligence and fundamentally gave up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. In 2007, August, I sat with a group of researchers at IBM, and we decided that we had found a way to create an artificial intelligence system. 4 years later, on a game show called Jeopardy, a system called Watson beat 2 human beings together in an open domain question and answer in pure natural human language with no programming from a human being. It had learned everything. Fast forward 5 years from that, this past week, the Watson system had been trained by Memorial Sloan Kettering and the top oncologists in the world. And a research institution in Japan announced that a patient that had been diagnosed with leukemia that was being treated was about to pass. And the physician consulted the Watson genomic oncology advisor that had been trained at Sloan Kettering. And Watson declared on its own that that was not what was wrong with this patient. That was not the proper treatment. The doctor changed the treatment, and that patient now is alive and well. If this excites you, or this scares you, or anything in between, join myself and my colleagues, Walter Isaacson and Stuart Russell from UC Berkeley, an expert in artificial intelligence, here at 9:40 tomorrow morning to learn more about this game-changing technology.
And so we come to our last speaker. And you know, maybe we don't need the robots. Maybe we've just become super good about the care of our bodies. Do you want to hear some myths, half-truths, and outright lies about your body and your health? I can tell you a few about mine. In the recital hall on Saturday at 2 o'clock, you'll meet the man who famously said, "You don't have to drink 8 glasses of water a day." Dr. Aaron Carroll.
Well, clearly I lost some kind of bet because I'm now the only thing standing between you and cocktails. So about 3 months from now, as we get towards Thanksgiving, you will be inundated with stories, as you are every year, about how turkey makes you sleepy. And as you hear these stories, you will nod along because you will already know why turkey makes you sleepy. As we all know, it's tryptophan. And we know that there's a lot of tryptophan in turkey, and therefore if you eat a big meal with lots of tryptophan in the turkey, you're going to get sleepy. And that's a nice story, and they tell it every year, but the problem is none of it is true. There's not a lot of tryptophan in turkey. So it has about the same amount of tryptophan per ounce as ground beef. It has significantly less than pork products or cheese, and yet nobody would ever say the ham and cheese sandwich made me sleepy. It's always the turkey. Moreover, if you buy tryptophan as a sleep aid and you look on the side of the bottle, it will say, make sure you take this on an empty stomach. Because the worst way to get tryptophan is to try to absorb it in a big meal. It's terribly absorbed with food. So you're not getting a lot of tryptophan in your turkey, and a big meal like Thanksgiving will be the worst way to try to get any tryptophan in your body. This myth is entirely false, and yet you will hear it every single Thanksgiving. So my real job is, I'm a pediatrician and a health services researcher, and my parents don't even understand what that means. But the bottom line is that My job is to go out and get research and evidence and try to figure out ways that we can improve the cost, quality, and access to the US healthcare system. And I love my job. But what I really love, what gets me out of bed every day, is trying to use those same skills, on trying to figure out how we can use data and evidence and research to try to convince you that these things that you know just aren't true. And there's tons of them. And I made whether it's in books, whether it's in videos, whether it's in columns that I write, this week I spent time trying to convince you that there are really 250,000 people don't die of medical errors every year. In recent weeks, I've spent time in my columns trying to teach you that meat isn't going to kill you, or that getting kids to avoid peanuts completely is probably a terrible way to prevent peanut allergy, or one of the bigger ones, to try to convince you that breakfast really isn't the most important meal of the day. That's what we're going to be talking about on Saturday. These things, these simple things that you know, then I'm going to try to convince you that they're just not true. But more importantly, I'm going to try to convince you why they're not true, to try to explain to you that all research isn't the same, that some is better than others, and try to get you to understand that you have to start doubting why a lot of the stuff that medical people know just isn't true as well. All that on Saturday, in under an hour, and you'll look so smart at parties.
Oh, yeah.